Good morning, everybody. So good to see you guys, and glad you made it out and made it through the night. I know we had our power go off a few times, but we had that fireplace going, so we felt pretty good. But glad to be here with you guys. I love being together. I love that's kind of what holidays are about, right? I mean, you kind of got extended family, and some of y'all are probably in here with people that you don't see all the time. And I just have flashbacks over here because remember when Scott and Sarah, remember when we were at ASU and Zach would dance over here, and now we got Brooks over here putting on the show. So it's good. Getting together is good. It's one of the things about holiday that it makes it so fun is getting people together, but it's also the kind of the thing that also makes it a little bit tense sometimes, not in the fact that you don't get along, but sometimes it conjures up things of distance and the feeling like you wish somebody was there that's not there. It seems like the holidays magnify everything. It magnifies the joy, it magnifies the sorrow, so there's always kind of a mixed bag with it, but it's really rooted in this idea that we were built for relationships, right? I know that in our culture, it's a little bit different. I mean, I think this age we live in is a little bit different the way we experience that. How many of you have iPhones in the house today? Several of you? Okay, you're an Apple crowd. How many of you got the new update that tells you how much time you spend online? How many of you were totally freaked out when you saw that? Like you saw how much time you were actually spent on something. Well, if you pull that up, you'll see on there social networking. You'll have a tab in it. This is what's interesting about this age is you can actually not guess and not think about how much time you're doing something. Your phone will actually tell you the reality of how much time you're doing something. One of the things it tells you if you've got that update and you're daring enough to look at it is how much time you're spent on social networks, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever that thing is for you. It will tell you how many hours a week, and probably it's a little bit scary for a lot of us because we didn't realize that's how much time we were spending doing that. But if you think about what kind of makes you gravitate toward that, makes you pull up your phone and look at those things and kind of look back through friendships and photos and all these comments and like things, double tap something so you can put a heart on something to show you like something. Well, what's driving that is this attitude or this thought, this feeling that we need to connect with people. We are made to have a relationship with other people, and in a world where we're more seemingly connected than ever before, one of the ways we choose to do that is through social media. And so we do that in the palm of our hand, but then we also do it at holidays. But I would say that that's just kind of a general thing, right? It's a general thing that pushes us to connect with people, to be in each other's presence, to feel the thing that happens when we go through defeat. It softens defeat. When we celebrate life's victory, it sweetens victories. That's why when your team wins, you can high five and hug people you don't know. And that's why when you're going through something difficult, someone can give you a hug or say a word, and it will touch you, and it will provoke something in you, even if you don't have a deep relationship with them, because there's something about being connected to one another, being in one another's presence and feeling the connectedness that it brings. But nothing says more about our need for connectedness than when you're going through something. When you're going through a difficulty, when there's something very real. If you've ever been through the horrors of a divorce, if you've ever been through the loss of a loved one, if you've ever unexpectedly lost your job, if you've ever had a broken friendship or relationship, there is a feeling that kind of accompanies any difficulty, is there not, that makes you feel like you're all alone. You say things like, well, I feel like I'm by myself. Where'd everybody go? I feel like I'm never going to get out of this situation. There is a gravitational pull in difficulty to make us feel more and more disconnected than we would in our normal life. And in response to that, we call out, we need somebody to come to our aid. And as it stands, a lot of times we want somebody that just comes, and what we would say is we just want somebody to care. We want someone to empathize with us. We want someone to be where we are and just look us in the eye and say, hey, I know, I've been there, I sense what you're feeling, and you're not alone. I'm here in the room with you. But we would be honest, we need more than empathy. Some of us were saying, I just need the courage to go on. I don't feel like I can get out of the situation. And so what I need is I need someone to encourage me. Someone says to you, hey, you can do it. You can keep going. Don't give up. And sometimes we need to hear those words, not just I care and I understand, but we need someone to say, hey, get up, keep on going. And then if we were honest, sometimes the encouragement and the empathy doesn't do it. We need some advice. We need somebody to tell us what we're supposed to do when it seems cloudy and chaotic. There are some things that just dictate the fact that my knowledge is limited and I need someone from an outside perspective to give me some advice. I need some words of wisdom. And I think if you were honest, then you would say there's been times in your life where you've needed some empathy, you've needed some encouragement, you've needed some advice. But let's be honest. When things are really bad, empathy won't work. When the situation is dire, sometimes encouragement doesn't really matter. And sometimes, earthly wisdom doesn't really carry the day. And so when we're really looking at what we need when it comes to Christmas, and we sang a lot of songs today about the fact that Jesus is our Emmanuel, that He is God with us. Formative for us is the understanding that Jesus did not just come to empathize with us. And that's interesting because a lot of us, we come in church world because we just want to see if God cares. God didn't just come to encourage you. He didn't just come to say, hey, you can go out there and do another week, or you could do another year or another month. He didn't just come so He could be kind of like your self-help manual and help you with a little bit of advice for your relationships or your money. He came to do something radically different than all that. For us, the understanding is that sometimes when empathy doesn't work and encouragement doesn't matter and advice won't carry the day, we need someone with the power to actually do something. And if you don't get that, then just look at any political election, the way that politicians, leaders, authorities, bosses, CEOs, parents, pastors, the way that you're measured by history, the way that you can tell if someone was good in their role or not, is not whether they were empathetic. History will judge them as ineffective. Not whether or not they were a great orator and encouraging. History would deem them ineffective. Whether they gave some good, sound advice, history would say they were ineffective. Because we know the person we vote for, we work for, or we follow, we don't want someone that's just empathetic. We don't want someone that's encouraging. We don't want just someone that can give advice. We want to know somebody that can answer the question, can they actually affect change? And this is what Christmas is. Christmas is the arrival of the one that has the power through His presence to affect eternal change. That's what Christmas is. Christmas that we introduced last week, this idea that God was entering into flesh, into mankind, introduces us to the fact that God didn't just come for a simple agenda so that you could feel sympathetic or sentimental around Christmas time. He came to get things done. And there's no better place to see that in Matthew chapter 1, in verse 18 through 25, a simple passage that's probably familiar to most of us, even if you're not a church person, because you've probably heard it around Christmas time. And there's a problem with that, honestly. There's probably a familiarity that breeds contempt kind of thing going on. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the fact that this episode, this introduction to Jesus, is all about the fact that God came in with the power to change things. And so in a world, too, in a church world, that seems like you come and say, okay, what is the application for me? I'm going to just tell you on the outset, I don't exactly know the specific application for you today. Matter of fact, I would dare say that this passage is not really even about you today. As a matter of fact, if I was going to be honest, it may be good for you to hear that I don't actually think the Bible is really about you. I actually believe that the Bible is about the one we're about to be introduced to, the person of Jesus Christ. And I also believe that if we focus on Him and learn who He is, then the outpouring of that is bigger than empathy, bigger than encouragement, and bigger than advice. It has the power to change you when you take your focus off yourself and we look to Him. So let's get to meet this guy named Jesus. This is what He says, Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. Simple words. The word birth is the same word we get the word origin from. It's if you read the first book of the Bible, Genesis, it's from the same root word. It means the same thing. And matter of fact, some of you, maybe NIV translation might have a footnote at the bottom of it that actually says the word origin. This is the origin story of Jesus. And if you are a movie watcher, a book reader, or a storyteller, you know origin stories are important. This past year, we went to see this musical called Wicked. All right, now I'm bringing up Wicked in church, and okay, whatever. But here's the thing: it's a Broadway musical that's now kind of touring. It's been around since 2003. It's been in the theater since 2003, and it's been such a popular thing because it's continually ran over and over again in city after city, and it sells out crowds, and it's an awesome show. But here's the thing. The story of Wicked was a book written in 1995 that was actually a prequel to a book that was written in 1900. Most of us are familiar. If you don't know the musical Wicked, you know the story that it's derived from, the sequel to the play that was written after it, which is simply this: The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Wonderful Wizard of Oz, written in 1900 by a salesman that was just going about his business, came up with this idea. He wrote this book. And then just a few short years later, about 3 years later, became a play, became a movie, which became a famous one. But the play tells the origin story of the movie that was long ago. And it changes if you watch it. I'm not going to give a spoiler, but I'm going to tell you it will change the way that you watch The Wizard of Oz, because it tells the story of why the Wicked Witch of the West was actually wicked. What happened before to make her who he was. Now, if I just lost a lot of you because you're from Arkansas and you don't like the theater, there's a movie out called Creed 2, all right? We're going to go opposite direction. And Creed 2, though I have not seen it yet because I can't convince everybody in my world to want to go see it, it tells the story that was introduced from an origin story from a guy named Apollo Creed who had a son who fought a guy named Rocky Balboa, and we all better know who that is, right? Because here's what I think. Here's the point. Origin stories matter. And sometimes we read the birth narrative of Jesus and we forget the origin story. We forget the fact that the backdrop of the birth of Jesus had an immediate circle that it was born into, that he was born into. If you extended that circle out a little bit further, you would see that it extended out into a time frame and a setting, and you would extend it out into eternity, and you would see that this is the narrative not just of a birth of any baby, but this is the birth of God's own Son. That the origin story that we get to peer into in Matthew chapter 1 and introduced to has a backstory that's been going on a very, very long time. What is that story? Well, that story is really simply this, is that when the world of the Jews, when the Jewish nation, when they were looking for what we introduced last week, the Messiah, they weren't necessarily thinking. They were not thinking. I'll just tell you this. They were not thinking that God would become flesh. They were looking for an earthly figure that would do something, that would come in and perform something, that he would right the political wrongs. It was really a political movement. It was them in the context of understanding that they believed that God was eternal and God was holy, and yes, God was present, and God had a relationship with them, but their immediate predicament and their history told the story of the fact that there was nation rising against nation, that the promise long ago for them to be the nation that was going to be the greatest nation the world had ever seen, this small, seemingly uninfluential and really unimpressive group of people would be the nation that God would choose to use to become a blessing to the nations. And so while that was the promise, their experience that had bared that out over centuries and millennia had actually proven the point that they spent more time in captivity and more time in oppression than they actually did living out of the identity of what God had called them to be. And so, time after time, year after year, God would send prophets, he would send priests, and he would send kings to remind them of the promise, because they had to be reminded, because everything that they saw was broken down. And as it is with any political movement, fast forward to 2018, what do we look to politicians to do on our behalf? Well, practically speaking, we have things like Center for Disease Control. We have the FDA. We have things that are influential in making laws and really valuing and putting forth bills, and all that is for our general well-being, because that's what we see politicians performing and doing on our behalf. In the same way that you would have that desire to have leaders that would come in and they would address the ills of society, the systematic oppression, the diseases. Likewise, Israel was looking for the exact same thing. But they weren't looking for God to become flesh. They were looking for a Messiah that would come, and he would be the king that would restore Israel. And in restoring Israel, from the very bottom to the very top, everyone would feel the goodness, the fullness, and the peace that his reign would bring. And so Matthew introduces for us his answer to the Messiah story. And it is a cataclysmic collision. It is the story of a group of people that are under Roman and religious oppression, longing for someone, a political figure, to come in and right every wrong. And every good Jewish parent would be hoping that their child would be the promised one, would be the promised Messiah, because they weren't expecting God to become flesh. It wasn't until Jesus arrived, and in Matthew's words, that they began to put it into perspective, and all the pieces began to fall together. And so what do we get in verse 18? We get the origin story of Jesus. And he says, this is the way it took place. This is what he says. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. And we know the story, right? This is an interesting phenomenon, because if you kind of juxtapose or lay on top of the Luke passage and the Matthew passage, if you just set them together, what you find out is that Mary found out before Joseph found out. I don't exactly know why God chose to do that. I don't know if it was for dramatic effect or what, but it put Mary in a really difficult position to have to go to Joseph and say, hey, guess what, I'm pregnant, and she's betrothed to him, and to have a really awkward, difficult conversation. I don't know exactly why God chose to do it that way, but Joseph was presented with something that did not make sense. Why? Because he did the math, and he knew that 1 + 1 = 2. And that's the most sensitive way I can say it in a family service. He knew that there was a way this happened, and he did the math, and the only thing he could figure from an earthly perspective is that Mary had been with another man. And so what did he do? He decided to do, out of care and concern for her and for her reputation and the reputation of their families, to divorce her quietly, to end the betrothal and not consummate the wedding and the marriage. But something happened. In verse 20, we're told that God intervenes. As he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. Hang on a minute. This is not a young girl trying to convince her betrothed husband of what happened. This is God intervening and informing Joseph. This is what's taking place. And he introduces into the mix, into the expectation and all those things, he introduces the concept that God would come in such a way that he would come and he would bear a child. And in bearing a child, he would become flesh. That this child has a miraculous beginning. And that sets the stage from the backstory of the origin of Jesus for us to understand exactly who he is. And then where we're going to camp out is the next few verses, because this is what I know. We have 4 daughters, and I can remember when we found out we were pregnant with our first daughter, one of the first things, and I don't know if you're like me, so I'm not going to impose this on you, but one of the first things I thought, other than the fact of I don't know what to do, the next thing I thought of is, what are we going to name her? Or him. I didn't know it was even a her at the point, so what did we do? We came up with names for hers and hims, And I'll just be honest, every time we thought we knew we were going to have a baby, I thought it was going to be a boy, so I always came up with the boy name first, okay? And every time I was completely wrong. But it was fun for us to sit around and think of a name. We thought of family names. We thought of names that we liked the sound of. And your mind goes to people that you name them after, or people that you know that you certainly don't want to name them after, right? And if you're the guy, your responsibility, for those of you that haven't been through this yet, is your responsibility as the dad is to hear the name suggested and then try to rhyme everything that the other kids are going to rhyme with it so that you can protect your child really quick. And it's fun because you're sitting there like, oh, no, we don't like that name, and so we're going to name it that, name the baby that, and we live with it for a little while, and after a few days, you're like, no, I don't know about, calling the baby that for the rest of their life. And some names, they just have a character of their own. Like one of the names we came up with was Ace. And I like the name, but like that's a personality all to itself, right? If you name a child that. But here's the deal. For us, we understood something that you understand as a parent, and if you have a name, which you do, your parents probably went through, is there's power in naming something. There's an automatic connectedness to the naming process. And so the way that Matthew tells the story is he goes into the naming process. And he's going to leverage the naming process to help us to see how this one who is arriving actually has the power to do more than anyone expected. And this is how he introduces the naming process. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now, there are a few things. As I said, as a parent in America, it's the only thing I can speak from because it's my background, is that it's fun to name your child, and it's kind of neat, and I don't want anybody else naming my kid. I don't want them to tell me, hey, this is your son's name, or this is your daughter's name. I want that authority, but in the Jewish mindset, it wasn't just kind of this inherent feeling of, well, I should get the chance to do that. No, this was the privilege, the right, and the responsibility of the parent, predominantly the husband, to actually name, or the father to actually name the child. And the reason for that is that the name carries so much more weight than your favorite TV star or your favorite musician or naming after a sports star. It really carried the weight of the individual's identity. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but you can read through the Old Testament and you could see how much weight the name carried. Every name had a meaning, and every name was tied to an identity. It was who you were. And you could speak life and you could speak purpose into a child just through their name. And so when we get to Matthew chapter 1, into a Jewish mindset, into an already difficult situation, the angel says to Joseph, not only should you keep the child, but you are going to keep the child, and you don't get the right and responsibility to name the child. This puts Joseph in kind of a passive, he's just a tool in the story, he's just there. He's kind of operating in it. He doesn't get to name the child. No, why? Because the only one who gets to name the child is the father of the child. And the father of the child had already said, this is the name of the baby. And so the first part of the naming process is who gets to name the kid? Who has the authority? The second part of it is, what does that name actually mean? Because the name is the identity. The name is the purpose. And we're told a name that we're really familiar with, the name Jesus. But we're going to hang out on the name Jesus for a second because I think we are so comfortable with it. It's on our lips so much that we don't necessarily see the significance of the name. But the way that he lays out the naming process, he's going to put two names together, but he's going to start with the first one that's the most familiar with us, Jesus. And he's going to tell them, this is what I want you to name your child. I want you to name him Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. Now, here's what you need to know. The name Jesus in the original language was actually Yeshua. That was a name that actually meant something very specific in their mind. It meant Yahweh. The first part of that, of Yeshua, Yeh, is actually from the name Yahweh. Yahweh, and the last part of it is saves. And so what does he say? You're going to name him Yeshua because he's going to save, because that's what he does. Now, that doesn't mean a whole lot to us as 21st century Americans, but for them, their mind automatically knew what that meant. The name Yahweh was the covenant name of the people of God with their covenant God. That was the name that was given all the way back in Exodus. In order to see how these names tie together, I want you to look in Exodus chapter 3 first. Exodus chapter 3, we're introduced to Jesus, Yahweh, this way. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Remember the setting? God visits this guy named Moses. Why? Because God's people are already in captivity. They're already down there under Pharaoh's hand, and he says, I want you to go, Moses. I want you to go get my people out of there. And he's just like, hey, I'm just a dude up here. I don't think I can do that. God says to him this, I will be, what does he say? I will be, let's all say it together, with you. He says, I will be with you. I will be in your presence, is what he says. And this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you get brought to the people of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So, formative to the name of God in Exodus chapter 3 is the question, how will I know that I can go do this? Here's the thing. Moses didn't need empathy. Moses didn't need encouragement. You can do it, Moses. He didn't need advice. Okay, here's the strategic plan. I want you to hit them on the right side, then flank them on the left. He didn't come up with any of that stuff. What did he say? What you need is you need the one who has the power to go with you. And that's who I am. So Moses responds. Verse 13. What does he say? Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? Because wouldn't that be what you ask? They don't know Moses. I mean, they've never seen Moses before. He shows up on the scene and he says, hey, follow me out on this jailbreak. And they're going to say, well, first of all, where'd you come from? And he's going to say, hey, the God of your fathers sent me. Oh, yeah? What's his name? That's a key question. If you don't know their God's name, then you're not going to follow the God that says he's representing them, right? I mean, it makes perfect logical sense. And so he asks the question, hey, if they ask me this, they're going to say, what is his name? What am I going to tell them? Well, this is what he says. This is what you tell them. This is what he said to Moses. Tell them, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to them, to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you, which is a really funky sentence in English. But here's the deal. This was God's self-disclosure statement. In essence, what is he saying? He's saying that I am today the same that I'll be tomorrow. I am the eternal God. I am the one that is outside of time. And I am going to be with you. Because you don't need advice. You don't need encouragement. And you don't need empathy. You need the one who has the power to release the captives. And I'm coming with you. So as he hears this, God continues to say to Moses. In verse 15, he says this. God also says to Moses this. Say this to the people of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name. For how long? Forever. And this I am to be remembered throughout when? All generations. So this is not bound by time. This is who God is. This is how the New Testament, the Old Testament, and every testament is connected together. It's the fact that there is one common thread through it all. It is the God who is never changing, who is eternal, and who is active in his creation, in his relationship with his people. So what are you supposed to say? You're supposed to say, the Lord, the God of your fathers, has sent me. Now, we've got all this in all caps, which is a little unfortunate for today. Because if you read your Bible, okay, in actual copy form, like one of these things, they have these at Barnes & Noble and Lifeway and Amazon. If you're interested, you can grab one or go out there and we'll give you one. What you're going to find in there is sometimes you're going to see the word Lord with a capital or a small L, O-R-D, or a capital L and an lowercase O-R-D. But sometimes you're going to see it with all caps, L-O-R-D, when everything else around it has normal sentence case, okay? Capitals and lowercase, those kind of things. And that's intentional because every time that you see the all caps Lord, and this might be new to you, then what is that saying? That is God's covenant name that's introduced in Exodus. It is God's name, Yahweh. And why is it Yahweh? It was a Hebrew word that they didn't really even know how to pronounce. They've kind of settled through the years to pronounce it Yahweh, but the problem was that ancient Hebrew didn't have any vowels in it. And so it basically, if you saw it written out, it'd be Y-H-W-H, and they filled the vowels in, and then they said Yahweh. But something happened about 200 years prior to the birth of Jesus is the Jewish people stopped saying that name. The reason they stopped saying that name, most scholars will tell you, is because they were afraid that they would take the Lord's name in vain. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. That was something very important to a Jewish mindset. And so they had so much respect and so much fear for the name that they would not even say the name. But when the name was first introduced, Yahweh, he says, this is the thing. When you go, I'm going to be with you. This is the way I'm supposed to be known today, tomorrow, and forever. Every generation, your kids and your kids' kids, everybody's supposed to know who I am. And if you fast forward from Exodus chapter 3 to Exodus chapter 33, and I promise I'm going to turn the corner on this, but you got to kind of get this in your head for Matthew 1 to make sense. If you turn to Exodus 33, you get another episode with Moses where he's talking to God, and it has everything to do with the name and the presence of God. Moses says to the Lord, see, you say to me, bring this people up, but you have not let me know who you will send with me. Moses is asking the same question that he always asks. Will you be with me? I don't want to go alone. I don't need a plan, don't need encouragement, don't need empathy. I need you. Yet you've said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. If you skip to verse 14, he says, my presence, this is God responding, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. And he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. This was Moses now. He's not going to get the people. Now he has the people. They're supposed to go into the promised land. And he said, hey, don't lead me forward. Don't take me down to get them, and don't lead me forward with them if you're not with me. What was on the mind of Moses from the very beginning is the same thing that's on your mind. What role does God have in your life? If he's just a counselor, it's incomplete. If he's just someone to listen to you and encourage you, it's just incomplete. If he's your personal self-help manual, it's incomplete, because this is really not your story. This is his story. And you'll really never find freedom and peace and joy and all the other things that you're really searching for until you begin to locate all those things on his presence and his alone, because he's the only one who has the power to actually change things. He's not a counselor. He's not just an advice giver. He is the eternal God forevermore. Same yesterday, today, and forever. The writer of Hebrews drew the two together between the New Testament and the Old Testament, and he defines Jesus this way in chapter 1. Long ago, and in many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He's the one that was there in the beginning. But then he finishes up in verse 3 with this powerful statement. He is, right now, the radiance of the glory of God in the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. What are we looking at in Matthew chapter 1? The radiance of the glory of God that Moses saw and spoke to on a mountaintop. The one that led him down to get the Israelites out of bondage and captivity. We have the one in Jesus that has arrived, and he has come so that he could come, and he upholds in his power everything that you see and everything that you experience. And the fact that you have not yet recognized him today or honored him does not even threaten him. It's not a threat to his authority, and it's not a threat to his power, and it's not a threat to his throne. But on the inverse of that, you will never walk in his power truly until you recognize who Jesus really is. And you see him for who he is, and you worship him for who he is. He is the radiance of the glory of God in the exact imprint of his being, his nature, and he upholds everything in the universe by the power of his word. That's what the angel told Joseph to name the child. Yahweh saves. Verse 21, if you saw it, right? I mean, you saw him say that. Why? Because he's going to save the people of their sins. But he draws the point home this way in verse 22. He says, and in case you missed it, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Names were really important. Began in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. We see he's from the genealogy of Abraham and David. We arrive at the climax of the first chapter, the origin story of Jesus, and we learn that his name is Yahweh Saves. And then Matthew inserts the parenthetical quotation in there. He says, in case you want context, this was to fulfill the promise, and you can look it up. It's in Isaiah chapter 7. The promise in Isaiah chapter 7 from the prophet that God himself would become the Messiah, which no one expected. He says, what you're looking at here is God arriving on the scene and God having the power. Because you don't need advice, you don't need encouragement, and you don't need empathy. What you really need is the one who can actually change things. So what does Joseph do? Verse 24. Joseph woke up from his sleep. He did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son. And what did he do? He called his name Jesus. Well, I guess so. I mean, wouldn't you? No, I like Benji better. No, you name him Jesus because now you understand. And it wasn't, I think, just because the angel said so. I think it's because he believed. This is who this is. And like Joseph had to make a choice to believe and obey, the question I'm going to ask every single person in here is, do you believe and will you obey? Because it's one thing to hear the story and say, man, I can't imagine what it was like to be Joseph. But here's the thing, you've got a story. And God has presented himself to you in the flesh. And in doing so, he's saying, I have come to be present with you. And I want to be more than your counselor and more than a shoulder to cry on. I want to be more than encouragement to you. I want to come and actually be the one who I've always been. The one who has the power to change. And so if you think about it, when verse 24 and 25, that should be the end of the story. But Matthew does something really interesting, and then we'll close. If you read the entirety of Matthew's gospel, and you could do that, it'd probably take you all day, but you could do it today. And what you'll find is that Matthew, as any good writer would do or orator would do, he would start in one spot when he knew where he was going to end, and he would end in the same spot, and he would build those two things together. He would book in the entire biography, as it were, to shore up what his main thesis was, what his main premise was, or his main point. And that's exactly what he did. How are we introduced to Jesus? He is named Jesus, for he'll save the people from their sins. And in case you missed it, he's Emmanuel. He is God with us. And what are the last words of Matthew? We find them in chapter 28. This is post-resurrection. Jesus comes to his disciples and he says, all authority, or you might want to say all power. All power in heaven and earth has been given to who? To me. In verse 19, he says, based on this truth, go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe, I might say obey, all that I have commanded you. And behold, what does he say? I am with you always, even until the end of the age. We're introduced to Jesus as the one who is Emmanuel, God with us. And what Jesus wants to know, in the way that Matthew punctuates, exclamation point at the end of the entire biography of Jesus is this, is that the same Jesus Joseph experienced is the same Jesus that is with you today. He is the exact same Jesus. He has the exact same power. And his presence, when we walk in his presence through his word and obedience through the Spirit, when we have that, then we can walk in the same confidence. Because sometimes when things are bad, you don't just need somebody in the room with you. You need the one that can actually change some things. And we have a God that is not detached. He is not removed. He's as personal as becoming the smallest human in the side of a big universe that he created and that he upholds. And the one that created oxygen took a breath. Why did he do that? Because he's the only one that has the power to do so. And it was the only way that he could exert his power on your behalf was to be present with you. So when love comes to town, he comes in power through his presence. And if you feel alone today, If you've been going through and you thought, well, I just need a little bit more wisdom, I'm confused. I just need a little encouragement because I'm down. I just need somebody to empathize because I feel alone. Know this, that Jesus is not less than that, but he's so much more. And what you really need and what you can find in Jesus today is you can find the one who is eternal. And he came on one night in a little faraway place that most of us in the room have not seen, never experienced. But on that night, he came just like he always comes. In simple ways, profound ways, but always in power. And if you're in a spot right now, know this, that he wants to come in power in your life too. And if Christmas is nothing else to you, know this, it's the time where Jesus Christ has arrived. And so what I want to ask you to do is this, I want to ask you to bow your head and close your eyes for just a second as we finish. And I'm going to ask you to look at Jesus in a fresh way today. Perhaps for you, it might be new to you, not as a little baby, and I would say not even just the sacrifice on the cross, though we want to talk about that, celebrate that. And we're so familiar with the resurrection and the stone being rolled away. I want you to see something bigger than all that real quick, if there could be anything. And I want you to see the God who is eternal for just a minute. It's what Isaiah talked about when he says, I saw the Lord exalted, and on his throne, the angels were encircling the throne saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The response of Isaiah the prophet when he saw the Lord, the covenant God, lifted up, when he saw him, his response would say, I'm a man of unclean lips and I live among a people of unclean lips. And while you would think that that would just be shameful for him, it was freeing for him. And so would you look to Jesus today? Would you look to the Lord, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the fullness of all he is, and would you worship him right now in your heart and thank him for who he is?